When I was a couple weeks short of my 70th birthday, I started thinking about my mother's mother, who lived to be 100, and her mother, who lived to be 102, and my father, who lived to be 90, longer than anyone we had ever heard of in his family. I began to think that maybe our generation could be the first to routinely live to be 100. When I talked about this at family dinner one night, my granddaughter, who was 5, said,
"What are you going to do for the next 30 years, Grandpa?"
Hello, I'm Dr. Janet Price.
And I'm Gregg Kaloust. And we are Oldish. And this is our podcast, Oldish.
If you're oldish or know someone who is, please join us every week for conversations amongst ourselves
And our special guests
about what it means to be oldish in the 21st century.
If you ever wonder whether you're getting old, you're oldish. What are you going to do for the next 30 minutes? Hi, I'm Greg, and I'm oldish.
Hi, I'm Janet, and I'm oldish. Welcome to this episode of the podcast Oldish, Conversations on Aging in the 21st Century. We're excited today to have our friend Leslie Ross-Degnan with us again. We are excited about looking at another book that focuses on oldishness, The Delight of Being Ordinary, A Road Trip with the Pope and the Dalai Lama by Roland Marullo. Leslie's going to walk us through some of the book and the author, and then we're going to jump into a conversation about what in this book sparked thoughts and feelings about oldishness. Leslie is a children's development expert, a published author, and a good friend. Welcome, Leslie.
Thanks, Janet. You always give me such a nice introduction. Yeah, let me just start out talking about Roland Marullo, the author of our book, The Delight of Being Ordinary. Well, he's kind of a local guy, at least from my point of view, because I live in Massachusetts. And he was born in Revere, Massachusetts in 1953. He's also a peer of ours. Yeah, so he grew up in Revere. He was raised as a Roman Catholic in a large extended Italian family. He says that he always had at least one and often two sets of Italian grandparents present in his life. Often they were under the same roof. He was well educated at Phillips Exeter Academy and then later went to Brown University, where he majored in Russian studies as an undergraduate and continued his graduate studies in Russian language and literacy. I think it's interesting that writers are often drawn to the Russian writers. So he's one of those. He was educated by Jesuits, which are the most liberal branch of the Catholic priests. So his sense of spiritual inquiry informs a lot of his work. So just take a look at some of his book titles. Breakfast with the Buddha, Lunch with the Buddha, Dinner with the Buddha. He's not a Buddhist. He was raised Catholic, but he's obviously curious about Buddhism. Other titles sound interesting, like The American Savior, which is a story about Jesus as president. Driving Jesus to Little Rock. That's another title. Also, Golfing with God. I don't think his intention is to be irreverent, but to find a unique and wonderful way of combining religion and things that he loves, like golfing and traveling. He's not afraid, obviously, to address some of the big questions about the existence of God. And that's a frequent theme in many of his books. So before we launch our discussion, let me just offer a brief synopsis of the novel for those of you who haven't read it. So this story is about what happens when the Pope and the Dalai Lama decide they need an undercover vacation. During the Dalai Lama's official visit to the Vatican, the Pope suggests an adventure. It's so unexpected and appealing that neither of the holy men can resist it. They both agreed, yeah, let's get out of here and be ordinary folks for a few days. The story is narrated by the Pope's cousin Paolo, who is also the Pope's personal assistant. Paolo is the one who's responsible for making this grand idea of an adventure a reality, along with Paolo's estranged wife, Rosa. They've been separated for several months, but they're not divorced. And Rosa is a very eccentric and outspoken woman who has a thriving business as a hairdresser and sometimes makeup artist for Italian movie stars. She's someone who can't resist an adventure, and she's more than willing to help the Pope and the Dalai Lama escape the Vatican. So, one day before dawn, two of the most famous holy men in the world slip out through the caves beneath the Vatican and into a lime green Maserati driven by Rosa to experience a holiday through the beautiful Italian countryside. Roland Marullo does a great job of crafting a novel here that makes us laugh. I thought this was pretty funny. It also makes us think about the demands of spiritual life, ordinary life, and the identities by which we all define ourselves. Let's talk about this idea of identity. It was pretty present in this novel. After the Vatican discovers that the Pope and the Dalai Lama are missing, they accuse Paolo of kidnapping, so that they all have to travel incognito now, disguising their true identities. Because Roses often did makeup and hairstyling for Italian movie stars, as I mentioned earlier, she has friends with access to theatrical wardrobes and props, and her friends agree to help out by using the tools of their trade. So they disguise the Pope and the Dalai Lama and Paolo. The Pope, if you remember, is disguised as a Swedish tourist in a blue business suit with a blonde wig, a goatee, and a mustache. I mean, just taking the Pope out of his robe is going to, I think, totally disguise him. And the Dalai Lama becomes an aging rock star with a long, shaggy wig, shades, and blue jeans. Most men are uncomfortable, I think, without their robes. Finally, Paolo is made up to resemble a boat person seeking asylum in Italy. I thought this was really kind of an interesting political idea. There's a time that this book was written. They give him lots of dark hair, and they even darken his skin a few shades with some kind of dye. So, our oldish characters disguise themselves to be ordinary. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to throw out, it's just so interesting to think about identity and what was captured and encapsulated in this book, because identity as we're aging is such a major theme. Who are we as we age? And also the idea of disguises. So looking at that too. So as we talk more, I think some of that will come out today. I found that to be powerful.
Well, yeah, I agree. In contrast to the Dalai Lama and the Pope disguising themselves to be ordinary, we tend to want to disguise ourselves to be extraordinary or younger or better or more beautiful or, different in some way, in a positive way.
Yes, exactly. And I think that for me was such an important message about, as we age, the delight of being ordinary and throughout our lives. But for us in this podcast episode, talking about the delight, can we say the delight of aging, the delight of being exactly who we are? And what does that mean? And what disguises do we use any moment in our day? And why? And then be able to just be aware of it.
I think it's an interesting flip on something that we've said several times in the podcast over the last couple of years, is that one of the issues of oldishness is that we become invisible. That people don't notice us in the same ways that they used to. And here are these two of the most recognizable people in the world when you think that there are over 1 billion Catholics. And there's a whole lot of people who think of the Dalai Lama as a great spiritual leader. And so they needed to go the other way. They needed to become visible as somebody else, because there was no way for them to be really invisible unless they became not themselves visibly. They didn't change, although they did have some conversations that they probably didn't ordinarily have, but they didn't change specifically. I was thinking about the exact disguises. I spent some time wondering, why did Roland Marullo go to the trouble of picking out the specific disguises that he did for these characters? He obviously did it on purpose. He refers to them as how they looked many times in the course of the story, or the narrator does anyway. The thing about the Pope's disguise as the Swedish tourist was that, if I remember it right, his backstory was that he was supposed to be a very wealthy businessman. And I took that to be Marullo's comment on one of the roles of the Pope is to head up this giant financial organization. In addition to spiritual organization, the Catholic Church is a huge financial organization. So for him to be disguised as a wealthy businessman, I thought was very interesting. And for the Dalai Lama, his disguise as an aging rock star, his persona as perceived by so many people in the world, I'm pretty sure is, yes, he's a spiritual leader, but he's treated like a rock star wherever he goes. And he's greeted by throngs who are not Tibetan Buddhists, but they love the song he's singing, so to speak. So I thought that was a very apt disguise for him. And I do want to point out that the narrator quotes both of these men a lot. English is not their first language. They both speak with accents. He got the accents really down to how these guys actually talk, especially and maybe it's because it's more of my experience, is the Dalai Lama. I went and found some YouTube videos of the Dalai Lama talking to refresh my memory of how he sounds. And he sounds just like he's portrayed in the book. He questions a lot of the words. He frequently turns to his translator and says, "How do you say?" And that's captured in the depiction of his language. So I think Marullo did a really good job of that. And that's part of identity too. But I think their identities as more than just spiritual leaders. They're not just, the Pope isn't just a priest, and the Dalai Lama isn't just a monk, although he says he's just a monk. But in real life, the Dalai Lama is not just a monk. So I think Marullo really captured their presentness a lot with the disguises that he showed for them. And one last thing I want to throw out is the structure of the book is a classical epic journey structure. It starts off with a journey through the underground when they escape from the Vatican through an ancient tunnel. And then they come up in this kind of magical wonderland where Rosa meets them with a Maserati of all things. When Paolo says, "Well, what's this Maserati? What are we doing? We can't ride around in a Maserati. Everybody will notice." And she said, "Nobody's going to be looking for the Pope and the Dalai Lama in a Maserati." So this whole wonderland thing took off right away.
Yeah, I think that's a great comparison to also the epic journey idea. I think that's spot on. But what about Paolo? I sort of feel like he gets left behind here. He's outshined by the Dalai Lama and the Pope. But he's made to resemble this boat person. And I think that he has, you're making me think about it actually in this moment. But when I think about him, I think he has real issues with his ego. And I think that maybe Marullo made him a less noticed kind of person, a person who's, I wouldn't say, is not somewhat reviled by the society in Italy because, the whole asylum-seeking person, and all the boat people coming into Italy at the time that this was written. There are a lot of angry feelings about that, mixed feelings about that. And so he made Paolo a minority. And I think Paolo's very proud of his Italian culture and very proud in general. And I think the problems that he and Rosa have, or a lot of them are, and the Dalai Lama has this conversation with him, a lot of them are as a result of, he's angry all the time. And the Dalai Lama says, "You're having issues in your marriage." And he says, "Yes." He said, "Sometimes that has to do with anger. And, anger comes from ego." And I think that's kind of wrapped up in the identity that they gave Paolo. So I think there is sort of a significance to the disguises of each of these characters, as you pointed out. And even more so, later in another scene in the novel, our characters are disguised in a different way at a masquerade party hosted by an old Italian actor who is a friend of Rose's. And they're looking for a place to stay for the night. He just happens to be having this wild Fellini kind of party from a Fellini movie. And those disguises, if you remember, do you remember what they were? Do you guys remember what they were? The Pope. I think they're interesting. They're more interesting and
See,
maybe more.
The Pope was dressed up as a king. And it was interesting that the host picked out the disguises and said, you have to wear them. So they were faced with, do they say no because it's just so maybe sacrilegious or, so the Pope was a king. I don't remember what the Dalai Lama was.
He was a police captain. Captain of the police. Yeah, he had a blue police uniform.
Well, so that was an interesting twist.
Yeah. I'm not sure what that was about, but maybe it was about him policing the faith of the people. But Paolo was a psychoanalyst, which I thought was kind of ironic. All these costumes are pretty ironic, I think, in that regard. When he actually needed a psychoanalyst, I think he was kind of a wreck, but real erotic.
Or maybe the message there was we all have within us everything that we need. And so for him, who's just bouncing all over the place, what's going on in my marriage? Am I a good husband? Was she a good wife? Could we be together? Can we be together? What's going on in this lifetime? It's almost like you already know the answers to all these things. So just relax and sit with yourself. So it's so fascinating. So he was put in that position of doing that for other people.
Yeah, and the host said that he couldn't move. He sat him beside the desk, and he sent other partygoers over to get analyzed, to get his help. And he told Paolo that he had to stay in that role, in that position, and talk to these people until the dancing started. So Paolo was accosted by two women who wanted to take him off and play with him, and some other people, and he was just aghast by this whole thing. He really was struggling to maintain his rigidity. He was a strict Catholic. He was very concerned about the Catholic hierarchy and the politics of the Catholic hierarchy, because he said many, many times that he had enemies in the Vatican who would like nothing better than to get rid of him and find a scandal about him, partially so that they could get rid of the Pope. The Pope was pretty controversial. He wasn't Italian, for one thing. So Paolo was struggling with his rigidity, counterbalanced by Rosa, his wife, who wasn't struggling with rigidity at all. She had a great time with all of this. She was just loving it from start to finish. But his internal dialogue, as he was riding along in the car, and the things that he pointed out, and the communications that he had with the Pope and the Dalai Lama and his wife, he was really struggling with his rigidity all the way through the book until he got to the end of the book. And for those of you who are wondering, we're not going to tell you the ending, so there's no spoilage. Somebody in the pickleball court asked me that yesterday when I told them what we were doing. He said, "Are you going to spoil this book?" We said, "Nope, no spoilers." You wouldn't believe it anyway.
I have a quote that relates to this moment, and it's about Paolo. It said, "Worrying is a form of control, a desperate attempt to bend reality to fit an imagined picture in our minds, imposing the future on the present." So
That's perfect.
so it's like, there he was bouncing around trying to stay in control, and that we can't. It's almost like the delight of being ordinary means we're going to trip and fall and question and try to figure ourselves out.
Well, yeah, I mean, these party disguises are really just the opposite of who these people are. I mean, like the Dalai Lama and the police captain, as a matter of fact, I mean, he's all about peace. I'm sure he'd never want to carry a gun or hurt anybody or do anything like that. So that was like the complete opposite of what he was. And Rosa was a nun, and that's about as opposite as her personality is, as you can get. So, yeah. And Marla must have had fun with this.
I also have quote about the man who had the party, Antonio Mazzo, who was old at this time and was an aging film star and was clearly very much into control and how he wanted things to work. So he had picked out the specific disguises for every single person that was coming to the party. But there was a quote of that he was unhappy in his old age. He was not at peace with old age. And so I thought that was interesting as far as the different characters that, so here's Antonio Mazzo, who just is an unhappy. He's heading into he's moving through aging and not happy with his life, not making peace with what has been in his life, and now very unhappy. And then here are these other two aging people, the Pope and the Dalai Lama, who are content and just wanting to be out in the world and step into a different life for a few days.
Well, that leads us into the whole idea of breaking our routines, like just part of the, still having a sense of adventure as you age, the way the Pope and the Dalai Lama did. They just really wanted to go off and cast off their roles as spiritual leaders and see what ordinary life is like, which is an adventure for them. The road trip changed their usual lives and routines in many ways, like this party that they went to and other adventures that they had.
Thinking about this from an Oldish perspective, maybe one of the challenges, exciting challenges from this book is that we're never too old to take risks, to try on different disguises or identities, to be creative. I mean, I think it really challenges that for us because our society, because most people think of getting older as stopping. You're done. Sit in that rocking chair, tell us stories from your past. It's all fine. And this book is saying, hey, what about jumping into a Maserati and going to a masquerade party? There was a quote that said, blend some risky creativity into your life. It's like, can we do that as we get older? How much older can we do that? Is there a certain age where we have to stop doing that? The book is kind of like, no, go for it.
Yeah, it really does go against that whole idea that aging requires that we maintain some kind of rigid routine in our lives in order to be safe and be well and stay in one place. But when in fact, just the opposite is probably more interesting for one thing and better for us as we get older.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you have to assume that Marullo was thinking a lot of these same things. He was in his 60s when he wrote this. The voice of Paolo is similar in some ways to the interior voice, perhaps, and I don't know this, but I'm just guessing that the interior voice of Paolo is similar to the interior voice of Roland Marullo at that stage of his life, where he's thinking about these questions. He's questioning his religion. He's questioning family life. He's questioning empty nesting. That's one of the oldish themes in this book, is that one of the reasons that Paolo and Rosa aren't together is that they're empty nesters and couldn't sustain the relationship they had once their daughter was gone. And so we get to visit the daughter, and she's way out there as far as behaviors that her father, Paolo, thinks are appropriate, but it's really clear how much he loves her and gives her, with some effort on his part, he's able to give her his blessing, so to speak, on how she's currently living her life, even though it's not what he would have chosen for her. So that's kind of oldishness in there too, is the thinking about what comes up next, dealing with the empty nesting and also dealing with the grown children who aren't doing it your way. And how do you handle that? Because you still love them.
Oh, yeah. He doesn't handle it very well, which is interesting, the way Marullo has him say, like, so she's in love with a Buddhist, her meditation teacher, and she doesn't really follow Catholicism anymore. She's becoming a Buddhist. At one point, when she says, we're getting married, I'm pregnant, we're getting married, right? Because her father says, well, will you baptize the baby? And I thought, isn't that a perfect example of how he can't like cope with the fact that, no, Dad,
Yeah.
I'm a Buddhist, right? We don't baptize babies. So,
Yes.
and then all she wanted to do, she was with the Pope and the Dalai Lama, was talk to the Dalai Lama. So that was tough for her dad, right? And you're right. His inability to accept and adjust to change was pretty evident.
And I wonder if that relates to the title, The Delight of Being Ordinary, in the sense of being ordinary includes the ups and downs, the bumpiness of parenting an adult child or being the parent of an adult child, that our children choosing paths and making decisions that might not be what we would want them to be doing. And that's part of life. So the delight of being ordinary. And maybe when we're going through these things, we wish we wouldn't have to go through these things. Then maybe we take on disguises, or we just don't accept. We certainly don't think of it as a delight.
Well, yeah. And you mentioned earlier too, Janet, that maybe this is a bucket list story.
Mm-hmm.
It is sort of a before I die or before I get too old, I really want to do this or that or have this experience or that experience.
Exactly.
Everyone steps out of their roles, whether they're willing or not, in the story.
Exactly. Exactly. It really seems like that to me, that for the Pope and the Dalai Lama, that they had this, it sounds like it was spontaneous in that moment, but that it must have been growing inside of them of, I am in this role as the Pope, as the Dalai Lama. I've accepted that. I'm content with that. And bucket list, it'd be nice to just travel through the streets of Italy without people kissing my ring. That's the Pope, or being a rock star, the Dalai Lama, to just enjoy the seaside, enjoy riding in a car, enjoy eating at a hot dog stand. So those were like bucket lists for them.
Yeah, I thought it was real interesting how they both responded to Rosa, a lot of whose role was to shake them up. Rosa played a major role in this change for everybody. Rosa decided that they were going to ride around in a Maserati. Paolo had said to her, you want to go for a ride, basically. So she took over and she got the Maserati. She made arrangements for the makeup and clothing and all that stuff for the disguises. And she chose their route and made it up as she went along to a great extent. They didn't have an itinerary. They just said, well, let's go over there and see about that. She also directed a lot of the thinking. So they're riding along, she's driving, and she says, hey, Pope and Dalai Lama, what do you guys think about sex?
Yeah, she had a lot of big questions. That's true.
Sex, role of women, do you go to heaven? All of that stuff.
That's right. And Paula was all nervous thought she was being very disrespectful.
She was the opposite of Paolo. It's almost like there were two sides of the same person, where Paolo was like, oh, all this stuff, and I we got to be careful. And she's over like, screw that. What do you guys think about sex?
Yeah.
Can you imagine saying that? Any of us saying that to the...
Oh, yeah. And then the Dalai Lama, too, he said, well, he had a great answer. He said, well, if you have a lot of lifetimes, and in those lifetimes you have a lot of sex, there comes a time when you don't find it necessary anymore. And I thought, well, that's interesting. You have other things that are more important to you.
Yeah.
Have been some reflection on the delight of being ordinary. That she was just ordinary. She was just, this is what I want to know. I'm going to ask it. This is what I'm curious about. Tell me. She didn't have disguises, those kinds of disguises.
She was the only one not disguised.
Yeah, even when she had a nun costume on, she wasn't disguised because it wasn't really evident what her role was in that party.
One thing I wanted to say is from a quote from the Pope in the book that jumped out at me was, he said, stripping away layers of accumulated identity over a lifetime to the essential you, being an ordinary man. So stripping away layers of accumulated identity over a lifetime. And I love that, because it's like, yeah, that is what we do, is we are the identity as a kid, as a grown-up, maybe as a partner, as a parent, as our profession. They're all legitimate identities. And, but to be able to strip away some of those layers of accumulated identity back to the essential you. So maybe that was a theme there for them as well. It goes along with identity, disguises, bucket lists, all the things we're talking about is how do we get back to the essential you?
And also, taking risks, learning to do that, and you're not stopping with that and confronting fears. And I think that Murillo took some artistic liberties here because we're thinking, the Pope and the Dalai Lama are sort of superhuman in a way, but in fact, they had fears too. And he created some specific fears in the Pope and the Dalai Lama, sort of to just maybe make the reader think about that. And also to make them both seem more human or vulnerable to the reader. So in this ordinary holiday, they both had to confront these invented fears that Murillo gave them, which was that the Dalai Lama can't swim. He's afraid of water. And that the Pope is afraid of heights. And that was an interesting scene when they were going up to that mountain. It was a historical monument to Mussolini, I think. And they were on this ski lift and it stopped right in the middle. And Murillo really made that moment feel terrifying. And I thought that he did it so deliberately and literally. But the Pope got through that. He decided, okay, this is going to be okay. We're going to get through this. Yeah. And the same with the Dalai Lama when he couldn't swim, he did go in the water and kicked around. And I love that. I found a real joyfulness in that and a real comfort as an oldish person to see that these amazing men were out there confronting these simple, basic human fears that many, many, many people have. So I guess one of my questions here is, what are some of those other risks that they confronted? Were all these risks worth it? The risks that they took to take this bucket list journey, or whatever we want to call it, this epic journey in their lives? Do you think it was, in the end, do you think it was worth it for them?
Paulo was the one who was afraid for them because of their fears, right? So he says, oh, we can't go up on that ski lift because the Pope's afraid of heights. The Pope didn't say that.
No, but sure enough, his worst fear came true. Paulo's worst fear came true. Yep.
So their message about what somebody else thinks their fears might be was fairly important, because Paulo was projecting those fears onto those people who, and there might not have been some reality to it, but Paulo was the one who told us they were afraid of heights and water. They didn't ever tell us. The Dalai Lama didn't say, oh, you guys are going swimming, I'm afraid of water, I can't do that. Paulo said that. You're right. He did all the fearful work for everybody. He was busy. His brain was going constantly.
I wanted to respond to your question, Leslie. Was it worth it? And what is the message for each of us? So for me, it was, yes, it is worth it as we're aging and we're older to be thinking about and noticing and taking action on, is there some stuff in my bucket list that I would like to try to check off while I'm alive, and to just be able to not feel like we're too old to think about this. The book does talk directly about aging at times and some of the fears of aging. And so I found this quote especially powerful, which is, if we somehow find the courage to go directly into that discomfort, even the discomfort of illness, pain, old age, and death, we might discover something unexpected there, a courage, a resilience, possibly an identity that transcends that of this painful life. So I think that was part of the message too, is like, here they are, they're older, they're oldish, they've lived a long life, they're not done yet, but they do know what it's feeling like to age, and they're making some decisions about how to jump into some of their bucket lists. And that underneath all of that, or in surrounding that, is when we do lean in the midst of aging, it can have a profound impact on our sense of self.
I just wanted to say to Greg that I really had doubts about enough oldishness in this book, but the more you talk about it and think about it, and then Janet and I had a couple conversations about it, there really was plenty in there to talk about. So kudos. That
Well
was really
said.
fun.
I feel the same, and I'm looking forward to the next ones. So stay tuned. We'll have another book coming up in the near future that we can talk about from an oldish perspective. Thank you, Leslie, for joining us, as always.
It was my pleasure. The pleasure was all mine, and I agree with you, Greg. It's been really fun doing these books together.
So goodbye, everybody. Thanks for listening.
See you guys.
Thanks again to you both for this really lively conversation about a very lively book. Nothing ordinary about this conversation at all, even though it was delightful. See what I did there? It's always a pleasure to have these conversations with you two about these great books we've been reading. And I'm very happy to have you in my life and in our podcast. And so thanks. I would like to throw out one thing for our listeners. These book club conversations have been very popular, and lots of people come up to me on the pickleball court and they want to talk about the books. And I have many people who have said, what are you reading next? And they want to read it. So I think that really is terrific. So I would like to say to people in our listening audience, there's a place for comments on our website. You have to actually go there, even though you may be listening to the podcast in your car, sometime go to our website, put in a comment, tell us what you think about this book, but also if there's a book one of you thinks we ought to read, or you want to come on with us and talk about a book that you think is right up our alley, so to speak, please do that. The website is www.me, and we really would like to hear from you. Bye, Janet. Bye, Leslie. That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We had a great time talking about this book, and we hope you enjoyed it too. You can find links to The Delight of Being Ordinary and other books by Roland Murillo in our show notes and on our website. If you buy one of these books after clicking on the link, we may get a small commission, which helps to support our podcast. You can leave a comment and suggest a book for us to read or a guest to have a conversation with on our website at www.oldish.me. Join us next week as co-host Dr. Janet Price and Gregg Kaloust celebrate the 2nd anniversary of our Oldish podcast. What a great way to be oldish. If you like what you heard today, please tell a friend and rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.